Yeah, I feel like I'm going to be crowned Queen of England or something. I hope nobody's taking photographs of my activities in my spare time. Okay, let's just go. Yep.
I just want to preface my question. I'm a friend of Ed Paleo and Martha Schemmel in Berkeley, so I just wanted to make that connection. And I was at your talk there last spring.
Last spring, yeah. Which one?
At GTU.
GTU. What's GTU?
Theological Union.
Oh, yeah, right.
My question concerns your vision of a libertarian socialism and the way that we might get there. And what do you see as institutions in our society today, or structures you think that we can build on to move toward a society of justice and solidarity?
Well, the last two words define the vision, I think. Justice, solidarity, freedom, equal rights. These are all ideas that come straight out of the Enlightenment, and in fact out of classical liberalism, classical liberalism is very anti-capitalist, contrary to what everybody says. And classical liberal and Enlightenment ideals lead in a very direct path, I think, to what was called libertarian socialism or anarchism or something like that. The idea that people have a fundamental core right and need to be free, creative, not under external constraints, that any form of authority requires legitimation. The burden of proof is always on an authoritarian structure, whatever it may be, whether it's owning people or sex-linked or whatever, child parent. Any form of authority has to be challenged. Sometimes they can be justified, maybe in that case, okay, you live with them. But for the most part not. And that would then lead quite directly to what were kind of truisms about a century ago. I mean, now they sound really crazy because there's been such a deterioration of values. But if you look at the thinking of just ordinary people, like say the working class press in the mid-19th century, which grew, where the ideas just grew out of the same soil, Enlightenment, classical liberal soil. The idea is, look, obviously people should not be machines. They shouldn't be tools of production. They shouldn't be ordered around. We don't want chattel slavery, like black slaves in the South, but we also don't want what was called since the 18th century wage slavery, which is not very different, namely where you have to rent yourself to survive. And in a way, it was argued with some plausibility that you're worse off than a slave that way. Actually, slave owners argued that. When slave owners were defending slavery, there was a kind of a moral debate that went on, and it had shared moral turf, as a lot of moral debate did. And the slave owners made a plausible point. They said, look, we own our workers. You just rent your workers. When you own something, you take much better care of it than when you rent it. Like, to do it a little anachronistically, if you rent a car, you're not going to pay as much attention to taking care of it as if you own the car, for obvious reasons. Similarly, if you own people, you're going to take more care of them than if you rent people. You rent people, you don't want them anymore, you throw them out. You own people, well, you got a sort of an investment in them, so you make them healthier and so on. So the slave owners, in fact, argued, and that, look, we're a lot more moral than you guys with your capitalist wage slave system. And ordinary working people understood that. So, people would, like after the Civil War, you find in the American working class press bitter complaints over the fact that, look, we fought to end chattel slavery and now you're driving us into wage slavery, which is the same sort of thing. Well, okay, this is one core institution of the society where people are forced to become tools of others, machines, tools of others to be cast out if they're not necessary. I mean, that's just a grotesque arrangement, totally contrary to the ideals of classical liberalism or Enlightenment values or anything else. And it's now become a sort of standard doctrine, but that's just a victory of absolutism. And we should dismantle all that stuff culturally. It starts with cultural changes. You got to change your minds, and your spirit, and recover what was common understanding in a more civilized period, let's say a century ago, in the shop floors of Lowell, Massachusetts, and so on. Recover that understanding, and then we work to simply democratize in all institutions, free them up, eliminate authoritarian structures. As I say, you find them everywhere. I mean, you find them from families up to corporations, all kind of authoritarian structures in the world. They all ought to be challenged. Very few of them can resist that challenge. They survive mainly because they're not challenged. They're not really very strong. They look strong, but there's a point that was made by David Hume a couple hundred years ago, with it's worth bearing in mind. Hume was very conservative, as you know. He was so much so that Thomas Jefferson, the great believer in free speech, when he established the University of Virginia to be a counter to Harvard, so they wouldn't send Southern gentlemen up to be distorted by the Northern, Federalists. He was the founder of the University of Virginia, and you had to read the history of England in those. I mean, universities mainly law schools in those days, like you're training lawyers and people, and naturally had to read the history of England. And unfortunately, the main history of England was by David Hume, who had Tory ideas. He's very conservative, and Jefferson didn't want the students to be allowed to read it. So there was a Bowdlerized version. Somebody had written a version of Hume in which he had kept the same style but eliminated all the offending passages. So Jefferson insisted that that be the only version that students be allowed to read. They would be told it's Hume and so on, but that's Hume. Anyway, even though much too conservative to be allowed to be read by Thomas Jefferson's college, still he recognized, you look at his fundamental principles of government, he recognized something which is very much worth bearing in mind. He raised a kind of paradox of power. He said, how does power sustain itself? He said, if you think about it, power is always in the hands of the people who are oppressed. It's in the hands of the governed. They really have power. And this is true of the most oppressive society, what we would call totalitarian society, as of the most free. Power is in the hands of the governed, so how come they submit themselves to the authority of others? He said, well, force is an element, but he said the real element is opinion. You have to control their opinion. Of course, he was in favor of it. He's a Tory. So he says, well, what you have to do is make sure you control the opinion of the people, meaning make them believe, make them saturate their minds with ideology, carry out what we call propaganda. Didn't have the term in those days. And control their opinion, and you got them. That means you change their aspirations, you restrict their aspirations to personal things, to commodities, to break down the natural bonds among people, force them to forget what they understand, that they basically want freedom and independence and justice and so on. Every child understands that. So you have to work really hard to drive it out of their heads. And if you can drive it out of their heads and you control their opinion, then they'll submit. And they'll submit whether you're a brutal state or a more free society. In fact, it's more important in the free societies. In the 20th century, when in Hume's day, there wasn't much difference. Every society was absolutist. But as the societies differentiated over the years with popular struggles and winning the franchise and so on and so forth, the difference between the freer societies and the more like totalitarian or command societies became clearer, and a point began to be understood that Hume didn't talk about, and that is that control of opinion is much more important in the free societies. So like in, say, Soviet Russia, they didn't really care much what people thought. Franco Spain, let's say, fascist state, people read much more broadly and widely than they do in the United States. It's true, in fact. You go to a Marxist bookstore, if you got out of line too much, okay, they send you to the torture chamber in downtown Madrid. But since there were techniques of control just by force, there was not much, wasn't much concern about what people thought. It's sort of believe what you like, we'll beat you over the head with a bludgeon, When you get to the freer societies, there's a lot more concern with what people think. And that has been understood. That's part of the reason for the rise of the public relations industry in the United States. Public relations industry is a propaganda agency of business. which was, it's an American creation. You know, it was created in the early part of the century to try to, as they put it then, to control people's minds. And that's, you know, I don't know if they read Hume, but, you know, it's not a deep point. Anybody can understand it without reading Hume. They understood that unless you control people's minds, we're going to be in trouble. People's mind, you know, what was called in the business press, the greatest hazard facing industrialists is the rising political power of the masses. I'm quoting. I mean, you should recognize that the business press is very Marxist, super Marxist. I mean, all the values are inverted, you know, but they believe in class struggle. They talk about the masses, you know, and beating down the masses and all that sort of thing. In fact, business press reads kind of like Maoist tracts, little red books and things, just with all the values reversed. And they understood that you've got to control people's opinion because, as Hume put it, power is in the hands of the governed, if they ever realize it. And if they realize it and they try to recognize what their own values are and pursue them, we're really going to be in trouble because there's not going to be any way to control people. Well, okay, you ask what institutions can change things. I think if you think it through, it's kind of obvious. You have to start by changing people's minds. I mean, take, say, something pretty close to here. Take, say, liberation theology in the 70s and 60s and 70s. How did it work? Well, you know, people, priests and nuns went and started base communities where people read the Gospels and they thought about it. You know, peasants, maybe illiterate people, or who knows, you know, but they thought about what it meant. They gave their own, you can interpret it in a lot of ways. They gave an interpretation which was oriented toward the preferential option for the poor. People began to do things like, I mean, I saw some of this happening. You know, you go to a very, I remember once going to a village in Nicaragua, which was run by an extremely conservative order of nuns. I forget which one, but the one that runs all the schools for girls in Latin America. Somebody, I forget who they are, you probably know. But, you know, there's real ultra right-wing, you know, but they were working in a village where the peasants were so isolated from one another that they couldn't even work together to the point of trying to get water. And one of their biggest, and they were good people. I mean, the Mother Superior was walking around, you know, trying to convince people to get injections and things like that. And their big achievement when I was there was that they had gotten the peasants to cooperate enough to work on a common well. They had you wouldn't believe the way it worked. There was, you know, this is real poor country. So they had an ox, and they tied had a rope tied to the neck of the ox, or however it works, and it was pulling the ox climbed up a hill, and as it climbed up a hill, it pulled water out of the well. And then people would come and, you know, take the water. It's the first water they ever had. And then the ox would be led down to the bottom of the hill again and would walk up. Okay, that was a real achievement. And it was helping bring people to understand, look, you work together, we're all better off. The kind of, you know, authoritarian regime that you've lived under, which kept you separated and kept you isolated, is just destroying you. To try to get those thoughts into people's heads is hard. And once it gets started, it goes on, you know, and then they develop cooperatives and associations. And then, of course, the death squads come, and the U.S. trainers come, and people like you and me pay taxes to killers who will put an end to all of this. Well, okay, you think this through, it's not very hard to figure out what ought to be done, whether it's there or whether it's here. And the aim ought to be to dismantle authoritarian institutions. And like I say, they're all over the place. You find them in the family, but the core ones, the ones that simply have to be radically changed if you're ever going to have a free society, are the institutions the institutions that involve production and distribution and decision about what life is going to be like, and that happens to be in executive boardrooms, like the hotel where I was staying last night. You know, you walk around and you see who's making the decisions. Not very hard to find them, and those sectors of society, with their extraordinary power, it's now, you know, even international, and huge agglomerations of power. They have plenty of violence behind them. Much of it is provided by the United States. There's a reason why we have more than half of the total military expenditures of the whole world. The reason is because we're the big killers. And we have to be around to make sure that nobody gets out of hand. You know, peasants start building a well, we've got to be in there to have a death squad that'll take care of them. And that's a lot of what we're involved in. And you and I are involved in it, because this is a pretty free country. Like, if we're involved in it, we decided to be involved in it, or we decided to look the other way, or something like that. Okay, those are things that can be done. And on, up till the point where you just dismantle. And I don't think these institutions are very strong. I agree with Hume. If people change their conceptions and decide, look, I'm not going to be kicked around, and you get together, there's nothing to stop you from taking over a factory, let's say. I mean, the police will stop you, but if the police are just other people, and if understanding and solidarity has spread enough, they won't stop you. Incidentally, that's why when countries are ruled by either colonial rulers, or every country's kind of colonized, you know, even if it's just in itself. I mean, there's some sector that colonizes everyone else. And it's even more dramatically obvious when it's a foreign ruler. What they typically do is use military forces that are not local. So like when in China, when they put down the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, you take a look at what they did. They did not use the local PLA, you know, army forces. They took them in from the provinces. When the British ran India, for 100 years, they ran it with Indian soldiers, but from other places. You know, like the Gurkhas, for example, you know, famous Gurkhas, they're Nepalese, you know, hill tribesmen, and you could sort of bring them down to smash up the local people. We do the same thing. We bring in, you know, sort of forces from the outside. Actually, it's going on right now in the occupied territories, in the Israeli-occupied territories. The Israel-Arafat agreement, one crucial part of it is to make sure that those territories are controlled by foreigners. They're called Palestinians, but in fact they are foreign Palestinians. Ones who are trained, who are brigades of the Jordanian or army or something like that. They're the ones who are being brought in. That's the standard technique of colonial control. So, you know, when you bring in, when they wanted to put down the Homestead strike in 1892, they get the National Guard from somewhere else, you know, not the local cops in Homestead. So yeah, there are police and there are armies and there are security forces, but, you know, and there are techniques which are well understood for using them. And the answer to that is just more solidarity, you know, broader solidarity. So you don't get soldiers from somewhere else who'll come and smash up people. That's hard, you know. I mean, it's the fact that societies are colonized and so stratified offers all kinds. It means you don't have to go very far away. Like when the Chicago police were trying to destroy political organizing in the Black Ghetto back in the 60s, they were able to work together with other criminal organizations like them, the FBI, and simply set up assassinations and other criminal activities to get rid of leaders in the Black Ghetto, which they did. And, you know, they happened to come from Chicago, but they came from a different stratum of Chicago, which was so separated it might as well have been from, you know, Alaska. And it's because of the stratifications and so on that these things work. Actually, it's kind of interesting. If you look at the details, it's very illuminating. So take Chicago. When the FBI was trying to, the Panthers in Chicago back in the 60s were a pretty constructive group. They were doing real things, a lot of community organizing and so on. And the main Panther leader was a guy named Fred Hampton. Maybe some of you know this stuff. This is your own history. You really ought to know it, a recent history. But at first, the FBI tried to use the colonization that is internal to the Black Ghetto. That is, they tried to get a black criminal gang to assassinate Hampton. Now, typically, the police and the FBI like the criminals. They work with them. They're more or less the same class and the same interests, and they're all involved in the same control system, so a lot of interaction, like Colombia or anywhere else. You know, the security forces and the criminals are all in the same bag. You know, they have the same interest. So the FBI, in fact, had pretty good relations with the main criminal gang in the ghetto, which was the Blackstone Rangers. And they tried to get the Rangers to kill Fred Hampton. The way they did it was by, a lot of this stuff came out in court cases right here in Chicago later. They sent fake letters to the head of